The Millionaire Mafia boss is enchanted at first sight by the bridesmaid who arrived late to his friend's wedding. A story about control, obsession, and the dangerous game that begins when two worlds collide. Every choice has a consequence, and for a man who rules from the shadows, and a woman who finds beauty in what is broken, the night before sealed a dangerous fate. Before we dive into this story, we want to feel your presence. Let us know in the comments which city or country you're watching from. We love knowing our story has reached you. And if you love intense romances about power and desire, and you want to be a part of this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Now take a deep breath. The real game begins now. A week passed. 7 days in which Clara's studio transformed from a sanctuary into a pressure chamber. The book, the damaged masterpiece, now lay in her workshop, a patient in critical care. And Matteo, the enigmatic patron, had become a quiet, constant presence in her life. He didn't call. He didn't send messages. He simply appeared. Today, he arrived shortly after noon. The delicate chime of the bell above the door announced his arrival, a sound that now made Clara's heart stumble. She was at her work table, hunched over a page of the Sforza, her magnification visor securely in place. The scent of old vellum and leather consolidant filled the air, a perfume that had always soothed her. Now, it only made her more aware of his scent. Ozone, expensive wool, and something coolly metallic she couldn't name. "You're making progress," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the observation of a man who had been watching. Clara flipped up her visor, blinking to adjust her focus. He stood on the other side of the counter, dressed in a dark charcoal suit that likely cost more than her entire setup. He didn't look out of place. He simply made the space around him reconfigure itself, bend to his presence. "I'm in the diagnostic phase," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm mapping every point of pigment degradation and testing the vellum's stability. It's a slow process. It can't be rushed." "I'm not in a rush," he said, his dark eyes fixed not on the book, but on her. He moved then, rounding the counter and entering her workspace. It was a silent invasion, a border crossing that made every hair on her arm stand on end. He didn't come too close, maintaining a distance that was technically respectful, but felt charged with a suffocating intimacy. He pulled over a simple wooden stool and sat, transforming the humble seat into a throne. And then he watched her work. At first, it was nearly unbearable. Every movement she made felt clumsy, magnified. The awareness of his gaze was a physical weight on her shoulders. She could feel the intensity of his focus as she measured the humidity of a page, as she mixed a wheat starch paste. He said nothing. He simply watched, and his silence was louder than any conversation. She tried to focus, to retreat into the familiar comfort of her craft. She explained what she was doing, her voice filling the silence, more to soothe herself than to inform him. "The vermilion used for the red is converting to metacinnabar. It's blackening," she said, pointing with a bone folder at a miniature of a saint. "I have to stabilize it before the loss is total. The gold, though, the gold is nearly perfect. It's true gold leaf, so it doesn't tarnish." "Does it tell you its secrets?" Matteo asked, his voice a low hum. The question caught her off guard. She glanced at him. He wasn't looking at the page. He was looking at her hands. "In a way," she answered slowly, "it tells me about the artist, about his haste in this section, his devotion in that one. It tells me about time, about what survives." What survives? The words hung in the air between them. Matteo leaned forward, his interest genuine and dangerous. "And what does it tell you about the original owner?" "She was wealthy, devout, likely a noble woman," Clara said, falling back on her professional script. A book like this was a status symbol as much as an object of faith. Faith and power, Matteo mused, almost to himself. Two sides of the same coin. He stood and walked to the work table, stopping beside her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She refused to shrink away. She refused to cede the ground. This was her domain. She continued her work, her movements now deliberately precise, a quiet demonstration of her own form of power. He reached out, not for her, but for the ancient page. His fingers, long and immaculate, hovered inches from the fragile vellum. "May I?" he asked. Clara's heart seized. No one touched her work, no one. But his request wasn't that of a curious client. It was a test. Another border he was asking permission to cross. She knew she should say no. It was procedure, the rule. But she heard herself say, very carefully. Slowly, he lowered his index finger. She watched, her breath held, as the tip of his finger brushed the unilluminated edge of the 500-year-old page. An impossibly gentle touch from a man she suspected was capable of incredible violence. And then, as he drew his hand away, the side of his finger grazed hers. It was a wildfire, an electric shock that shot up her arm and lodged itself directly in her chest. It was accidental, intentional. She couldn't tell. All she knew was that the texture of his skin against hers for a fraction of a second obliterated everything else. The book, the studio, the world outside. She pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. His eyes met hers. The air crackled. The professional pretext of their arrangement had utterly disintegrated. He was not here for the book. The book was just the stage, and they were the only two actors. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, referring to the touch, the permission, to something much deeper. He straightened and moved toward the door. "I'll be back tomorrow." It wasn't a question. It was a promise. Or maybe, she thought as her heart still hammered wildly, it was a threat. The bell chimed again, announcing his departure. But his presence remained, a phantom imprint in the air, an echo of the heat from his touch on her skin, and the terrifying, thrilling realization that she had just allowed him to cross a line from which there was no return. The next day, the chiming of the bell was not a surprise. It was an inevitability, a sound Clara had been waiting for with a mixture of stomach-churning dread and a thrilling, traitorous anticipation. Her hand, which had been steady all morning, trembled as she set down a fine-haired brush. She didn't look up immediately. She took a breath, composing herself, trying to rebuild the professional walls that he had effortlessly dismantled yesterday. When she finally lifted her head, he was already there, standing by the counter. But something was different. He wasn't just a passive, intimidating observer. In his hands, he held a small cardboard tray with 2 steaming cups of coffee. The gesture was so profoundly normal, so utterly out of character, that it disarmed her more than any power move could have. It was a gesture from her world, not his. An offering. A bridge. "I noticed you don't leave for lunch," he said, his voice a low rumble. He placed the tray on the counter. "I assumed you drank coffee." She stared at the cups. "You assumed correctly," she managed to say, her voice tight. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said simply. He walked around the counter, entering her space as he had before, but this time it felt less like an invasion and more like a return. He handed one of the cups to her. Their fingers brushed for a second time. This time she was prepared for the jolt, but it still shot through her, a familiar, terrifying warmth. She took a sip. The coffee was rich and dark, with a hint of cinnamon. It was exactly how she liked it. A coincidence, she told herself. It had to be. The alternative, that he had taken the time to learn such a small, intimate detail about her, was too much to contemplate. He didn't sit on the stool this time. He leaned against the edge of a heavy oak flat-file cabinet, sipping his own coffee, observing her with that same unnerving intensity. But the dynamic had shifted. They were not client and conservator. They were 2 people sharing a quiet moment, a small stolen pocket of normalcy. "You work too hard," he stated, his eyes scanning the meticulous order of her studio. "You're here when the sun comes up and long after it goes down." A cold tendril of unease snaked down her spine. How did he know that? She had never told him her hours. "It's my own business. The work demands it. Every business demands sacrifice," he said. his gaze meeting hers over the rim of his cup. "But you should be careful what you sacrifice. You'll never get it back." Was he talking about her or about himself? The line was blurry, a deliberate ambiguity that made her feel both seen and exposed. He was learning her, reading her pages, and she knew almost nothing about him, save for the dangerous energy that rolled off him in waves and the surprising gentleness he had shown her. Before she could think of a reply, a sound sliced through the quiet atmosphere of the studio. It was the vibration of a phone. His phone. It didn't ring. It just buzzed, a low, urgent hum from inside his suit jacket. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment, he was the man sharing coffee with her. His shoulders relaxed, a flicker of something almost warm in his eyes. The next, he was a different person entirely. His body went rigid. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of glacial command. A mask of granite slammed down over his features. He pulled out the phone, his movements economical and sharp. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. He didn't excuse himself. He simply turned his back to her. A gesture that was both a dismissal and a chilling form of protection, shielding her from what was to come. "What?" he answered, his voice no longer a low rumble, but a blade of forged steel. He listened, his stillness absolute. Clara stood frozen by her work table, the warm coffee cup suddenly feeling like ice in her hands. She couldn't hear the person on the other end, but she could see the effect of their words on him. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "No," he said, the single word and order that could level buildings. "That is not an acceptable outcome. Find him." Another pause. "I don't care what it takes," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a sound of pure, lethal authority. "I want it handled. Now. And I want no mistakes. Do you understand me?" He listened for another second, then ended the call. He didn't move for a long moment, his back still to her. She could see the tension in the line of his shoulders, the coiled power of a predator about to strike. The studio, her safe, quiet world of history and art, suddenly felt like the most dangerous place on earth. She had just been given a glimpse behind the curtain, a look into the shadows he inhabited, and it was colder and more terrifying than she could have imagined. Slowly, he turned back to face her. The mask was still in place. The man who had shared a dance with her in the moonlight was gone. In his place was the Don, the ruler, the man who gave orders that left no room for failure. His eyes met hers, and he saw the fear on her face. He saw it, and for the first time, a flicker of something, regret, frustration, crossed his features. He had let the mask slip. He had brought his world crashing into hers. "Business," he said, the word a completely inadequate explanation for the chilling command she had just witnessed. Clara couldn't find her voice. She just nodded, her throat tight. He looked at the half-finished coffee in his hand as if he didn't recognize it. He walked over to her counter and set it down. The sound was too loud in the ringing silence. "I have to leave," he said. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact. He walked to the door, his long, purposeful strides eating up the space. The bell chimed, and he was gone. Clara stood motionless for a full minute, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. The air where he had stood still felt cold. Her gaze fell upon the 2 coffee cups on her counter. One was hers, a symbol of a fragile, budding intimacy. The other was his. A piece of evidence. A remnant of a different man, a dangerous man, who had just reminded her in no uncertain terms exactly who and what he was. The silence Matteo left behind was different from the silences they had shared. It was not a space of tension or unspoken attraction. It was a vacuum, cold and absolute. Clara felt its weight pressing in on her. The ghost of his chilling phone call echoed off the walls of her quiet studio, staining the air. "Find him. I don't care what it takes. I want it handled." The words were clinical, devoid of emotion, and that was what made them so terrifying. It was the language of a man for whom human lives were merely variables in an equation. She couldn't work. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled. The ancient, delicate page on her desk seemed to mock her. What was the point of saving this small, beautiful piece of the past when the present, in the form of Mathieu, felt so brutal and dangerous? She picked up his abandoned coffee cup. It was still warm. She stared into the dark liquid, and for the first time, she allowed herself to confront the truth she had been desperately trying to ignore. This wasn't a romance novel. This wasn't a story of a dark, brooding man who would be saved by the love of a good woman. This was real. The power he wielded had real, and likely violent, consequences. And she, by allowing him into her life, was now standing on the edge of that darkness. Her first instinct was to run, to call him, though she didn't have his number, and tell him the commission was terminated, to say the book was beyond repair, to lie, to build a wall of professional excuses so high he could never climb it. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then, she thought of his eyes when he had turned back to her. She had seen the cold mask of the dawn, yes, but underneath it, for a fraction of a second, she had seen something else, a flicker of profound regret, the look of a man trapped in a cage of his own making, who had just accidentally revealed the bars to the one person he didn't want to frighten. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man who brought her coffee, who asked about the secrets of her books, who had looked at her not as an object to be acquired, but as a puzzle to be understood. It was this man, the one on the terrace, the one who had watched her work with quiet fascination, that she couldn't bring herself to abandon. The paradox of him was a hook, and it was lodged deep. She spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation, her mind at war with her heart. She didn't expect him to return. The business he had been called away to felt final, a grim curtain falling on their strange, fragile connection. The next day, she arrived at her studio with a new, somber resolve. She would focus on the work. The book was her shield. It was the reason he was here, and it would be the neutral ground on which she could survive his presence. She would be the conservator, nothing more. He did not come. The chime of the bell, which she had been dreading, remained silent all day. The silence was a relief, and to her shame, a disappointment. Another day passed, and another. The studio was quiet again, her sanctuary restored. But it felt different. It felt empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was just the absence of him. She found herself glancing at the door every time a car passed, her heart giving a hopeful, stupid leap. She hated herself for it. By the fourth day, a cold certainty began to settle in her stomach. He was gone. The incident with the phone call had been a line crossed, and he had made the decision for both of them. He had retreated back into his world of shadows and left her in her world of light. It was for the best. It was what she should have done herself. But it ached. It ached in a way she had never felt before, a hollow space where his intense, unnerving presence used to be. On the fifth day, she was working late, trying to lose herself in the intricate, meticulous process of readhering a piece of flaking gold leaf. The street outside was dark and quiet. The only sounds were the soft hum of her dehumidifier and the gentle scrape of her tools. That's when she heard it. Not the chime of the bell, but a sharp, insistent rapping on the glass of the front door. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one came to her studio this late. She crept to the front, peering through the security grill. A man stood on the cobblestones, his large frame silhouetted by the gas lamp. It wasn't Mathieu. This man was broader, his head shaved, his face set in a grim, unreadable expression. He wore a simple dark jacket, but it did nothing to hide the sheer, intimidating bulk of his shoulders. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This was one of them. One of the men from Mathieu's world. He saw her and gestured, not at the door, but at a long black car parked at the curb, its engine idling silently. The same kind of car she'd seen in the folder. Mathieu's car. The man didn't speak. He just waited, his presence an undeniable command. This wasn't a request. Clara's mind raced. She could refuse. She could call the police. But what would she tell them? That a man she barely knew, a man with no last name, had sent his driver to collect her? It was insane. And yet, the thought of Mathieu, the thought that something might be wrong, overrode her fear. Her decision was not a decision at all. It was a surrender to the inevitable. She took off her apron, switched off her work light, and locked the studio door behind her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. The large man opened the rear door of the car for her without a word. She slid onto the cool black leather seat. The interior of the car was dark, silent, and smelled of money and power. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, sealing her inside. As the car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently through the empty streets, Clara looked at her studio, her small, safe world, shrinking in the rearview mirror. She had no idea where she was going or why. All she knew was that she had just stepped out of her world and into his, and she had a terrifying feeling that she might never be able to go back. The car moved with an unnerving silence, a predator gliding through the city's veins. Clara sat perfectly still on the plush leather, her hands clenched in her lap. The city she knew, a place of warm brick, gas lamps, and human scale, dissolved behind them. They moved into a different city, a landscape of cold glass and steel towers that clawed at the night sky. It was Mateu's city, anonymous, powerful, inhuman. The driver, the mountain of a man with the shaved head, did not speak. He didn't even look at her in the rearview mirror. He was a part of the car, a functional component of the machine that was currently holding her captive. She tried to ask a question, to demand to know where they were going, but her voice died in her throat. The silence in the car was too absolute, too heavy. A question would feel like a violation, a foolish, fragile sound in this hermetically sealed world of his control. She watched the blur of lights, her mind racing. Was he in trouble? Was he hurt? Had the business from that phone call gone wrong? Or was this something else? A test? A punishment for her fear? The not knowing was a form of torture, a slow tightening of a knot of dread in her stomach. After what felt like an eternity, the car descended into the earth, down a steep, brightly lit ramp, into a private underground garage. It was less a garage and more a showroom. A dozen cars, each one a masterpiece of engineering and worth a small fortune, sat gleaming under the recessed lighting. The driver parked the sedan in a vacant spot, and the engine died, plunging them into an even deeper silence. He got out and opened her door. "This way," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. It was the first time he had spoken. He led her not to a public lobby, but to a single, unmarked steel door. He pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner, and the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a private elevator. The interior was paneled in dark polished wood and brushed steel. There were no buttons for floors, only a single glowing panel where the driver once again placed his thumb. The elevator didn't ascend. It launched. Clara felt a strange, weightless sensation in her stomach as they shot upwards, the movement so fast and silent it was disorienting. She had no idea how high they were going. 10 floors? 50? 100? The doors opened directly into a room that stole her breath. It wasn't a room. It was a cavern of glass and space. She was standing in what she assumed was a penthouse apartment, but it felt less like a home, and more like a perch at the top of the world. 2 entire walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a panoramic, godlike view of the glittering city below. The floors were black marble. The furniture was sparse, modern, and brutally expensive. There was no clutter, no books, no photographs, no sign of a life lived, only a life owned. It was the most beautiful, and the loneliest place she had ever seen. And there, standing in the middle of the vast space, his back to her, was Mathieu. He was looking out at the city, his city. He was still in a suit, but the jacket was off, slung over a chair. His white shirt was pristine, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, capable wrists. The driver gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Mateau's direction, and then retreated back into the elevator, the doors hissing shut behind him, leaving them utterly alone. "Mathieu?" she said, her voice a small, tentative sound in the enormous room. He turned around slowly. His face was a mask of exhaustion. There were dark circles under his eyes she hadn't seen before. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. A man at the end of a long and brutal war. Then she saw his right hand. His knuckles were raw and bruised, and a single, deep cut sliced across them. It was clumsily bandaged with a piece of gauze and tape, already beginning to bleed through. Her breath caught. The sight of that injury, so stark and real, cut through her fear. Her instinct, the one that drove her to mend and preserve, flared to life. "Your hand," she whispered. He glanced down at it as if he'd forgotten it was there. "An unfortunate consequence of a business negotiation," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He took a step toward her. "I'm sorry for the method of invitation. I knew you wouldn't have come otherwise. Where have you been?" The question slipped out, more personal and more accusatory than she intended. "Handling things," he said vaguely. He stopped a few feet from her, a chasm of marble and unspoken violence between them. "Clara, after what you heard, in your studio, I couldn't go back there. I couldn't bring that world to your door again. It was a violation. So you bring me here instead?" she challenged, a spark of her old fire returning. "To your world?" "Yes," he said, his gaze intense, unwavering. "Because I have spent the last 5 days trying to convince myself to stay away from you. For your own good. I have failed." The confession was stark, stripped bare of any romance. It wasn't a declaration of love. It was a statement of defeat, a surrender. He was a man addicted to a drug he knew would destroy him, and he had just admitted he was done fighting it. "I can't be the man who brings you coffee and talks about books," he continued, his voice raw. "Not all the time. This," he gestured around the vast empty room, at the city below, "is who I am. And the hand," he lifted his injured hand slightly, "is what I do." He was giving her a choice again. Not with words, but with the brutal honesty of his presence. He was showing her the monster, unadorned. Clara looked at his face, at the profound exhaustion etched there. She looked at the sterile, lonely grandeur of his home. And she looked at his hand, at the crude bandage, at the blood seeping through. He could command a silent army, move millions of dollars, bend the city to his will. But he could not properly bandage his own wound. The paradox of him struck her with the force of a physical blow. The all-powerful man and the wounded man. She closed the distance between them. She didn't hesitate. She walked across the cold marble until she was standing directly in front of him. She looked up into his tired, haunted eyes. Then, she gently took his injured hand in hers. His entire body went rigid at her touch. "You're going to make it infected," she said, her voice regaining its quiet, professional authority. The authority of a conservator, of a healer. "Sit down. I'll fix it." Mathieu didn't move. He stood frozen, a statue of disbelief, his injured hand held gently in hers. Her touch was the complete antithesis of the violence that had caused the wound. It was soft, sure, and utterly without fear. He stared down at their joined hands, his, bruised and bloodied, a tool of destruction. Hers, delicate and capable, a tool of restoration. The symbolism was so stark, so potent, it was a physical blow. "I said sit down," Clara repeated, her voice firmer this time. She gave his hand a gentle tug, a quiet, irresistible command that accomplished what no threat or show of force ever could. It broke his paralysis. He allowed her to lead him to one of the brutally minimalist black leather sofas. He sat, his movements stiff and unfamiliar, an emperor suddenly being told where to sit in his own throne room. He looked profoundly out of place in this moment of domesticity. "I assume a place like this has a first aid kit," she said, her tone all business now. She was in her element. Something was broken, and she was going to fix it. "Bathroom," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Through that door." He gestured with his head toward a black, seamless door in the wall that Clara hadn't even noticed. She gave a curt nod and went, leaving him alone on the sofa. The moment she was gone, he exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at his hand, at the place where her skin had just touched his. The warmth lingered. He had brought her here to show her the monster, to give her a final, honest chance to run. He had expected fear, revulsion, a retreat. He had not, in any possible calculation, expected this. He had not expected a quiet, determined competence. He had not expected care. Clara returned a moment later, her arms laden. She had found not just a first aid kit, but a pristine, professional-grade one. She had also brought a bowl of warm water and a clean white towel. She knelt on the marble floor in front of him, without a shred of hesitation, and placed her supplies on the low glass table. "This might sting," she said, her voice gentle. She carefully unwrapped the clumsy, blood-soaked gauze from his knuckles. The wound was worse than she'd thought. It was a deep, ragged gash across all 4 knuckles, the kind of injury that came from bare-fisted, brutal impact. The skin around it was swollen and an angry purple. She tried not to think about what or who his fist had connected with. The thought was a dark, cold thing, and she pushed it away, focusing only on the damage itself. Her touch was methodical, precise. She cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, her movements efficient and sure. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but she saw a muscle feather in his jaw. She worked in silence, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was no longer Clara, the late bridesmaid, the object of his obsession. She was the conservator, and this was just another fragile, damaged thing that needed mending. But it wasn't. The intimacy of the act was staggering. Kneeling at his feet, tending to a wound he had inflicted in his dark, violent world. She could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the expensive cologne. She could feel his eyes on her, watching her every move with an intensity that was more potent than any touch. She applied a thin layer of antibiotic ointment, and then began to bandage his hand properly, her fingers moving with the practiced grace of someone used to handling delicate materials. She wrapped the clean white gauze snugly but not too tightly, her movements economical and perfect. When she was finished, his hand was neatly and expertly bandaged, a small white island of care in the vast, cold landscape of his life. She looked up at him, her work complete. Her whiskey-colored eyes were serious, unguarded. "There," she said softly. "That's better." He looked from his perfectly bandaged hand to her face, and the expression in his eyes was something she had never seen before. It was a raw, unfiltered mixture of shock, confusion, and a vulnerability so profound it was like looking into the heart of a star. The granite mask was gone. The cold control had vanished. In its place was just Mathieu, a man completely and utterly undone by a simple act of kindness. "No one," he began, his voice thick, breaking slightly on the word. "No one has ever done that for me." The confession hung in the air between them, heartbreaking in its simplicity. It spoke of a lifetime of isolation, of a world where wounds were hidden, not tended. It told her more about him than any file or surveillance report ever could. The space between them crackled, the air thick with everything they weren't saying. The pretext of the injury, of the first aid, had dissolved. There was only this: a man and a woman, kneeling on a marble floor at the top of the world, suspended in a moment of impossible, terrifying intimacy. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his left hand. He didn't touch her face. He simply cupped her chin, his thumb resting gently against her jawline. His touch was a question, a plea, a statement, all at once. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. His gaze was locked on hers, searching, asking for a permission he had never asked for in his life. Clara didn't pull away. She didn't breathe. The world, the city lights, the silent, empty room, it all fell away. There was only the feeling of his thumb against her skin and the look in his eyes, and as his lips finally, gently, met hers, she knew she was lost. It was not a kiss of passion, not of hunger. It was a kiss of quiet desperation, a kiss of profound, aching loneliness. It was the kiss of a man who had forgotten what tenderness felt like, and a woman who was just beginning to teach him. It was a whisper of a touch, a promise of a pain, and a pleasure she couldn't possibly comprehend. And in that moment she didn't care. She simply kissed him back. The kiss was a lifetime. It was a breath, a question, a tentative answer. When Mateo finally, slowly, drew back, the absence of his touch was a physical shock, a sudden plunge into cold air. Clara's lips tingled, the ghost of his pressure a phantom presence. She kept her eyes closed for a moment longer, a desperate attempt to cling to the fragile, impossible connection they had just forged. When she opened them, the man kneeling before her was gone. In his place, the Don was reassembling himself, piece by piece. The profound vulnerability in his eyes was being shuttered away, the granite mask sliding back into place. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion, creating a sudden chasm of height and power between them. He looked down at her, not with the raw emotion of a moment ago, but with a new, unsettling possessiveness. The wounded man had been replaced by the owner. He looked at his bandaged hand, then back at her. "You have a healer's touch," he said, his voice a low, rough-edged sound. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, a statement of her value to him. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool marble beneath her knees. The spell was broken. Reality, cold and sharp, was rushing back in. She had just kissed a man whose hands were instruments of a violence she couldn't comprehend. She had tended to his wound, and, in doing so, had perhaps wounded herself far more deeply. She rose to her feet, her movements stiff. She needed to put distance between them, to find her footing in this new, treacherous landscape. "I should go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's late." "No," he said. The word was not a request. It was a quiet, absolute finality. Clara froze. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean you're not going home," he stated, turning away from her to look out at the glittering expanse of the city below. He was taking back control of the room, of the situation, of her. Not tonight. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, washed over her. She thought of her studio, her quiet street, her life. It felt a universe away. "You can't do that. You can't just keep me here." He turned back to face her, and his eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "I can," he said, the simple assertion of his power more terrifying than any threat. "And I am. The men who did this to my hand," he lifted his bandaged knuckles slightly, "are still a loose end. My building is the most secure place in this city. Your studio is not. You will stay here until I have handled the situation." Was it a threat or a promise of protection? With him, she was beginning to realize, they were the same thing. He was caging her for her own safety. It was a twisted, suffocating form of care that was born from a lifetime of control. "I am not your prisoner, Mathieu," she said, a spark of defiance cutting through her fear. "You are my guest," he countered, his voice smooth as silk. But the implication was clear. A guest who was not free to leave. "I have already had my driver retrieve what you will need for the night. It's in the guest suite." He had planned this. While she was naively thinking he had summoned her out of some emotional crisis, he had been setting the board. He had known, from the moment he sent his man to her door, that she would not be going back. The thought was chilling. It spoke of a level of foresight and control that was beyond anything she had ever encountered. "And the book?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. It was a desperate grasp for the one piece of her old reality she had left. "My work? My man will open your studio for you in the morning and escort you there and back. You will not go anywhere alone. You will not be out of my sight, or the sight of my security, for a single moment. Is that understood?" It was the same tone of voice he'd used on the phone. The voice of absolute, unquestionable authority. The voice that handled things. She stared at him, her mind reeling. She was trapped. She had walked into the beautiful, gilded cage of her own free will. Her empathy for the wounded man had led her directly to the mercy of the monster. And yet, even as fear screamed at her to fight, to run, to break a window and scream for help, a deeper, more treacherous part of her was quiet. A part of her that had felt the profound loneliness in his kiss. A part of her that looked at this powerful, dangerous man and saw a soul in more desperate need of restoration than any book she had ever touched. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own form of surrender. A flicker of something, triumph, relief, passed through his eyes. "The guest suite is the first door on the left down that hall," he said, gesturing to a long, dark corridor. "I trust you will find it comfortable." He turned his back on her again, a clear dismissal, and walked back to the window, resuming his silent vigil over the city. The conversation was over. The decision had been made. Clara stood alone in the center of the vast, silent room. She looked at her own hands. They were the hands that had soothed him, that had bandaged him, that had kissed him back. They had betrayed her. She slowly turned and walked down the dark hallway, her footsteps echoing on the marble. The door to the guest suite was ajar. Inside, a light was on, and on the perfectly made bed sat a small overnight bag. Her bag. From her apartment. The full, terrifying scope of his reach, of his power, slammed into her. He hadn't just invited her into his world. He had swallowed hers whole. The guest suite was another exercise in luxurious sterility. It was decorated in muted tones of gray and cream, the furniture minimalist, the art on the walls abstract and cold. It was less a guest room and more a high-end hotel suite that had been scrubbed of all personality. Her small, familiar overnight bag, sitting on the vast, king-sized bed, looked like an artifact from another, warmer planet. Clara walked over to it and unzipped it with trembling fingers. Inside were her things: a simple cotton nightgown, her toothbrush, a change of clothes for the next day. Everything was neatly packed. The efficiency of it was terrifying. He hadn't just taken her things. He had curated a selection of them. He had entered her private space, her home above the studio, and had moved through it like a ghost, taking what he needed. The violation was profound, a silent stripping away of her autonomy. She changed into her nightgown, the soft, worn cotton a small, pathetic comfort against her skin. She felt like a doll being moved around a dollhouse by an unseen, all-powerful hand. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sleek, modern dresser. The woman looking back at her was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange electric anticipation. She didn't recognize her. Where was the quiet, predictable book restorer? Sleep was impossible. The bed was comfortable. The sheets had a thread count she couldn't even guess. But the silence of the penthouse was unnerving. It was a dead silence, the kind that only double-paned, soundproof glass at the top of the world could provide. There were no city noises, no sirens, no distant traffic. It was the silence of a tomb. She lay awake for hours, her mind replaying the events of the evening, the cold dread of the car ride, the lonely grandeur of his apartment, the raw, bruised knuckles of his hand, the shocking, desperate tenderness of his kiss, and finally, the cold, quiet cage of his protection. He was a man of impossible contradictions, a brute who appreciated the soul of a 500-year-old book, a killer, she was sure of it now, who could be undone by a simple act of kindness, a captor who claimed to be a protector. Her mind struggled to reconcile these two versions of Mathieu, but it couldn't. They were two sides of the same violent, beautiful, terrifying coin. Eventually, she gave up on sleep. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet silent on the thick plush carpet. She crept to the door of the suite and opened it a crack. The long, dark hallway was empty. A single, low-wattage light cast long shadows on the marble floor. At the far end, she could see the faint, ghostly glow from the main living area, the city lights painting the darkness. She was drawn to it. A moth to a flame she knew would burn her. She padded silently down the hallway, every nerve ending alive with the fear of being discovered. When she reached the edge of the living room, she stopped, hiding in the shadows. He was there. He hadn't moved. He was still standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the glittering tapestry of the city. He hadn't changed. He hadn't slept. He was simply standing vigil, a king surveying his domain. But he didn't look like a king. He looked like a prisoner of his own power, of his own life. He must have sensed her presence. He didn't turn, but his voice cut through the silence, low and resonant. "You should be sleeping." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stepped out of the shadows. "So should you," she replied, her voice a little shaky. He finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable in the dim light, but she could feel the weight of his exhaustion, even from across the room. "Sleep doesn't come easy for me," he said. It was a simple statement, but it was laden with a world of meaning. It spoke of a mind that never shut off, of threats that never ceased, of ghosts that never rested. "Why not?" she asked, her curiosity overriding her fear. She took a tentative step closer. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "You have to be able to close your eyes to sleep, Clara. I learned a long time ago that closing your eyes is the most dangerous thing you can do in my world." He was letting her in again, giving her another glimpse into the stark, brutal reality of his existence. He was answering her questions honestly, without evasion. It was his new form of control, binding her to him not with lies, but with the terrible magnetic pull of his own truth. "It must be lonely," she said, the word a soft, empathetic whisper in the vast, empty room. His gaze sharpened. He had built an empire, commanded loyalty, inspired fear. But this quiet, unassuming woman was the only person to ever look at him and see not his power, but his isolation. "Loneliness is the price of power," he said, his voice rough. "There is no room for anything else at the top." "I don't believe that," she said, taking another step closer. She was barely 10 feet from him now. "I think you're just afraid." A dangerous silence fell. No one had ever called him afraid. The very concept was absurd. But the way she said it, not as an accusation, but as a sad, simple observation, it struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Afraid of what?" he challenged, his voice dangerously soft. "Of letting someone in," she whispered. "Of not being in control. Of what you felt when you kissed me." He moved so fast, she didn't even have time to gasp. He crossed the space between them in 2 long, silent strides. One moment he was by the window, the next he was standing before her, his body heat enveloping her, his sheer size and power overwhelming. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. His proximity was a cage in itself. "You think you know what I felt?" he murmured, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm on her skin. "You have no idea. You live in a world of paper and ink. You have no concept of the things I feel, the things I am capable of." "Then show me," she challenged, her voice trembling but defiant. She lifted her chin, meeting his dark, intense gaze. It was a dare, a reckless, foolish, beautiful dare, and it was all the invitation he needed. The dare hung in the air, a spark in a room filled with gasoline. Matu's eyes darkened, the last vestiges of his control burning away. He had offered her the truth of his world, and she had not run. She had walked toward him, looked into his darkness, and asked to see more. It was the most reckless, terrifying, and intoxicating thing anyone had ever done. He lowered his head, his lips hovering a hair's breadth from hers. "You don't know what you're asking for," he breathed, his voice a raw, ragged sound. It was a final warning, a last chance for her to retreat to safety. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. It was a lie. She was terrified. but she was more afraid of the empty, quiet life that awaited her if she backed down now. She was more afraid of never knowing. His response was not a kiss. It was a claiming. His mouth came down on hers, and all the restraint, all the careful control he had shown her before, was gone. This was not the desperate, lonely kiss from before. This was a kiss of raw, possessive hunger. It was the kiss of a starving man who had just been granted a feast. It was powerful, demanding, and it sent a shockwave of pure, unadulterated heat through every nerve in her body. Her mind went blank. All thought, all fear, was incinerated in the fire of his touch. There was only sensation. The firm, insistent pressure of his lips, the faint, rough scrape of his evening stubble against her delicate skin, the clean, masculine scent of him overwhelming her senses. He tangled his uninjured hand in her hair, tilting her head back, deepening the kiss. His other hand, the bandaged one, came to rest on the small of her back, pressing her body against his. She could feel the hard, unyielding wall of his chest, the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. Or maybe it was her own. She couldn't tell. They were a single, chaotic pulse in the silent room. She didn't just surrender to the kiss. She met it. Her hands, which had been frozen at her sides, came up to grip his shoulders, her fingers digging into the fine cotton of his shirt. She kissed him back with a ferocity that surprised them both, a wild, untamed response from the quiet, careful book restorer. It was a release of all the fear, the tension, the unspoken longing that had been building between them since the moment she'd stumbled into that church. It was a kiss that sealed a dangerous pact. It was an acceptance of not just the man, but the monster. He broke the kiss, but only to trail a line of fire down her jawline, his lips finding the frantic, fluttering pulse at the base of her throat. Clara gasped, her head falling back in a gesture of pure, instinctual submission. She was drowning, and she didn't want to be saved. Mathieu, she breathed, his name a broken prayer on her lips. Hearing her say his name seemed to break something in him. He lifted his head, his eyes burning with an emotion so intense it was terrifying. It was more than just desire. It was a fierce, savage possessiveness. It was the look of a dragon who had just found his treasure. "You are mine, Clara," he growled, the words a low, guttural sound from deep in his chest. "You were mine from the moment you walked into that church. You just didn't know it yet." The words should have sent a chill of fear down her spine. They were the words of a captor, a tyrant. But in the fire of the moment, they sounded like a vow, a promise of a fierce, all-consuming devotion she had only ever read about in her books. He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Clara's gasp was muffled against his shoulder as he carried her from the living room, down the long, dark hallway. He didn't take her to the sterile guest suite. He carried her past it, to a door at the very end of the hall. His door. He kicked the door open and carried her into his bedroom. It was as vast and minimalist as the rest of the penthouse, dominated by a huge, low bed and another wall of glass that looked out onto the sleeping city. He laid her gently on the cool, dark sheets of the bed, his body following hers down, caging her with his arms on either side of her head. He looked down at her, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his eyes blazing in the dim light from the window. The city lights cast a mosaic of shadows and light across his face, making him look both beautiful and demonic. "If I do this," he said, his voice a raw, strained whisper, "there is no going back. For either of us. You will be in my world. You will be a part of it. A part of me. Do you understand?" He was giving her one last out. One final, honorable retreat from the precipice. Clara looked up into the face of the most dangerous man she had ever met. She saw the monster. She saw the protector. She saw the lonely king. And she saw the man who had kissed her, as if she were the only source of light in his endless darkness. She lifted a trembling hand and laid it against his cheek, her thumb stroking the rough line of his jaw. "I understand," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. His control, which had been stretched to its breaking point, finally snapped. Hearing her whispered, "I understand," was the only permission his soul had been waiting for. He lowered his head again, but this time, the kiss was different. The initial firestorm of possession had passed, replaced by a wave of something far more potent. A deep, aching tenderness that felt like a revelation. It was a kiss of exploration, of reverence. He memorized the shape of her lips, the taste of her, with a slow, deliberate thoroughness that made her tremble. Her fear, which had been a wild, thrilling current, melted away, leaving behind a profound, liquid warmth that pooled low in her belly. This was not the monster claiming his prize. This was the man worshipping at the altar. His bandaged hand came to rest on her hip, a point of anchor, while his uninjured one traced a delicate path from her shoulder, down her arm, to her hand. He laced his fingers through hers, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture of such unexpected courtliness, such knightly devotion, that it brought tears to her eyes. The paradox of him was a constant, dizzying assault on her senses. The hand that took, and the hand that cherished. He moved from her lips to her cheek, to her temple, his kisses feather-light, whispers against her skin. "Tell me to stop." He breathed against her ear, his voice a strained, ragged sound. "Clara, if you want me to stop, you have to tell me now." He was giving her the power. In this one, sacred space, in the heart of his fortress, he was yielding his legendary control to her. He was making himself vulnerable, not just to her touch, but to her will. "Don't stop," she whispered back. The words both a plea and a command. That was all he needed. A shift happened, a silent communication passing between them. He sat up, pulling her with him until she was sitting in front of him on the vast, dark bed. The city lights behind them cast their bodies in silhouette, two figures on a stage at the top of the world. He reached for the simple cotton straps of her nightgown. His movements were not rushed, but filled with a profound, deliberate intention. He looked into her eyes, his own dark and fathomless, as his fingers brushed her shoulders and slid the straps down her arms. The soft fabric pooled around her waist, and the cool air of the room kissed her skin. He didn't look at her body. He only looked at her face, watching her, reading her every micro-expression. He was giving her every opportunity to halt, to retreat. But she didn't. She held his gaze, her heart a wild, frantic drum against her ribs. There was no fear left. Only him. He leaned in and pressed his lips to the hollow of her throat, and then lower, to the space between her collarbones. His touch was electric, a brand of heat on her cool skin. She arched into him, a silent, instinctual offering. His arms went around her, pulling her flush against the hard warmth of his chest. His bandaged hand was gentle at her back, a stark white reminder of the world outside this room, while his other hand tangled in her hair, cradling the back of her head. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent as if he had been deprived of air. "Clara," he murmured against her skin, her name a sound of both reverence and desperation. The world outside, with its violence and its danger, ceased to exist. The lonely penthouse, the cold marble, the silent city, it all faded to black. There was only the darkness of the room, the warmth of their bodies, and the silent, earth-shattering language of touch. There was only the feeling of his skin against hers, the solid, grounding weight of him, the quiet strength in his arms. It was a surrender, a homecoming. It was two profoundly lonely souls, from two impossibly different worlds, finally finding a sanctuary in each other. Clara woke slowly, drawn from a deep and dreamless sleep. The first thing she became aware of was the light. A soft, gray, pre-dawn light was filtering through the massive windows, painting the room in shades of charcoal and silver. The second thing she became aware of was the weight. A heavy, muscular arm was draped possessively over her waist, holding her securely against a firm, warm body. She was lying on her side, facing the window, and Matteo was curled behind her, his chest pressed against her back, his breathing a slow, even rhythm against her neck. He was asleep. Truly, deeply asleep. The man who had confessed that sleep didn't come easy to him was lost in it. His body relaxed, the ironclad control he held over himself completely gone in his slumber. In sleep, he looked younger. The hard lines of his face were softened, the perpetual tension in his brow erased. He looked peaceful. The sight was so intimate, so profoundly vulnerable, it made her chest ache. This was a side of him she suspected no one else in the world had ever been allowed to see. The king, with his armor laid aside. She lay perfectly still, not wanting to wake him, wanting to preserve this fragile, impossible moment of peace. She was in the lion's den, but the lion was asleep, and in his sleep, he was just a man who had held her all night as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. She looked out at the city, still veiled in the morning mist, and a terrifying thought took root in her heart. She had come to his penthouse as a prisoner, a guest, an object of his obsession. But as she lay there, held in the arms of the sleeping dawn, she realized the truth was far more dangerous. She was no longer his prisoner. She was home. The moment of peace was a fragile, beautiful lie, and it was shattered by the sound of his phone. It was not the urgent, vibrating hum from before, but a soft, discreet chime from the bedside table. It was enough. Mathieu was awake instantly. There was no grogginess, no slow transition. One moment he was in a deep, peaceful sleep. The next, he was utterly awake, his body tense, his eyes alert and scanning the room. The predator was back. He saw Clara, awake and watching him, and the hardness in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second. A flicker of the man who had held her, before the dawn reclaimed his throne. He disentangled himself from her, the loss of his warmth immediate and absolute, and reached for the phone. He answered, his voice a low, clipped murmur. "Report." Clara sat up, pulling the dark sheet up to cover herself. She couldn't hear the words from the other end, but she watched his face. She watched the subtle tightening of his jaw, the cold, calculating look that entered his eyes. "Good," he said finally. "No loose ends?" He paused, listening. "Excellent. Maintain surveillance. I'll be there in an hour." He ended the call and placed the phone back on the table with unnerving precision. The business was concluded. The men who had injured his hand had been handled. She didn't need to ask what that meant. She knew. The cold reality of the world she had just stepped into washed over her, stark and brutal in the gray morning light. He stood up from the bed, completely unself-conscious in his nudity, and walked toward the bathroom. He was a creature of power and scars, his back a tapestry of old, faded wounds that spoke of a life of violence she could barely imagine. He was beautiful and terrifying. When he emerged a few minutes later, he was dressed in a fresh pair of dark trousers, toweling his wet hair. He looked not at her, but toward the door. "My driver is waiting for you downstairs," he said, his voice flat, neutral. "He will escort you to your studio. You will work on the book. He will wait for you. At the end of the day, he will bring you back here." It was a schedule, an order. There was no trace of the man who had whispered her name against her skin, no echo of the desperate tenderness they had shared. This was the transaction, the price of their intimacy. She had healed his wound, and in return, he would now own her safety, her schedule, her life. Clara felt a cold knot of despair tighten in her chest. Was this it? Was this all it would ever be? Moments of stolen, impossible intimacy, followed by the cold, hard reality of his control? "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He stopped, turning to face her. "No, no," she repeated, pushing the sheet away and standing up, her own nakedness a statement of defiance, not submission. "That is not how this is going to work." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of dangerous curiosity in his eyes. He crossed his arms over his chest, waiting. "I will go to my studio," she said, her voice gaining strength, "and I will work on your book." And at the end of the day, I will lock my door, and I will go upstairs to my own home, and I will sleep in my own bed. That's not an option, he stated coldly. It's not safe. I am not one of your possessions, Matu, she shot back, her voice ringing with a passion that surprised them both. You don't get to lock me in a tower, no matter how beautiful it is. I am not a rare book you can place in a climate-controlled vault for safekeeping. My life, my quiet, dusty, little life, is mine, and I will not give it up. She was challenging him, directly, not with a dare in the dark, but in the harsh light of morning. She was laying down the terms of her surrender, and they were the terms of an equal, not a captive. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. She could see the internal war raging in his eyes. Every instinct he had, every lesson his brutal life had taught him, was screaming at him to force her, to chain her to him with security and surveillance, to protect what was his, to control her. But he also saw the woman standing before him. Not a fragile object, but a pillar of strength. The woman who had faced his darkness without flinching. The woman who had healed his hand. The woman who had met his hunger with her own. To break her spirit, to force her into submission, would be to destroy the very thing that had drawn him to her. He slowly, deliberately, uncrossed his arms. It was a gesture of concession, a lowering of his shields. If I let you go home, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, I will have men on your street, on your roof, watching every window. They will be ghosts. You will never see them, but they will be there. If a fly lands on your window pane without my permission, I will know about it. That is the only way. It is not negotiable. It was still a cage, but it was a cage built around her world, not one that tore her from it. It was a compromise, from a man who did not compromise. Clara looked at this impossible, dangerous man, and she saw the colossal effort this concession was costing him. He was trying. In his own possessive, controlling way, he was trying to meet her halfway. She walked toward him, stopping just before him. She reached up and laid her hand on his cheek, her touch gentle. I can live with ghosts, she whispered. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, leaning into her touch. It was a silent, profound surrender. My driver will take you home at the end of the day, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he would never name. The war wasn't over. The dangers of his world were still there, waiting in the shadows. And the conflict between his need for control and her need for freedom would be a battle they would fight every single day. But as Clara stood there, in the heart of his lonely kingdom, with her hand on his face, she knew it was a battle she was willing to fight. She had been brought here to restore a book, but she had found something far more complex, far more damaged, and infinitely more precious. She had found a man, and she was just beginning to discover the secrets hidden in his pages. The story of Mateo and Clara wasn't over. It had just truly begun.